Hello everyone, my name is Alison DeLapp. I have been a part of Overland Expo for 7 years now. I joined the team shortly after I finished this trip I'm about to share with you. In 2012, 2013, I took a solo motorcycle trip from Los Angeles through Mexico, Central, and to South America. So these are 10 of the lessons that I learned along the way. Hope you enjoy, and let's get started. First thing you'll notice when you get south of the border is that traffic laws are just suggestions. Most of the people kind of abide by them, but for the most part, you'll see people kind of taking the right of way where they want to. Overloaded trucks, underpowered trucks, you kind of just got to find your rhythm amongst them. Most of us kind of think of this as adventuring, as being in these wide open landscapes down dirt roads in the backcountry. But the reality is, if you're on a time constraint like I was, you're going to be riding a lot of on-road. So brush up on your on-road as well as your off-road driving skills. Like you'll see here, the truck has the right of way even if it's into oncoming traffic. One suggestion I recommend you follow is honk before entering tunnels, because again, trucks have the right of way. This was me barely making it through alongside a truck. There's people up top cheering me on. It's kind of hard to see in the photo. But if I was not comfortable in tight spaces, then I probably would have had to back up the entire length of the tunnel in order to let this truck through first. Luckily, I grew up riding motorcycles in Los Angeles and in California, where we can lane split. So I was used to those narrow passages, and also aggressive driving, which kind of you'll have to kind of take part in if you want to get anywhere in south of the border. Leads me to pack lighter than you think. First time I set out on a journey, I was completely overpacked. I took everything that I thought I needed, all of the, but what if I need this or that? I loaded it in there. I had wider panniers. I was completely loaded on top. My suspension was overloaded. I could barely keep the thing up. I ended up taking it around the block, knowing that I couldn't control the bike safely, parked it for the next week or so. I basically took everything off and really pared down what I was going to take with me, packed a whole lot lighter, and was very thankful for it along the entire trip. So packing lighter will also help you get through doorways. As seen entering this courtyard, I ended up staying quite a bit in hotels in town, because just at the end of the day, I wanted to offload and be able to walk around town without all my gear on, try the food, go into shops, just to kind of explore locally what the culture had to offer. Sometimes I would see, sometimes I'd park my bike inside an actual building in the lobby or entryway, because most hotel owners, see the bike as an expensive commodity and will help you, secure it safely for the night. One might think that's kind of funny that a KLR is seen as expensive, but compared to the smaller, lighter bikes that they ride down there, it is. So here's an example. As you can see, Venezuela, motorcycles are the transportation of choice. I got stuck on a bridge and basically, again, aggressively had to inch my way off the bridge so that I could actually get into the road and on my way again. Again, I was thankful that I wasn't too wide and was nimble and could make my way through. To ask or not to ask questions or directions. That's a tough one. I could ask 3 locals where someplace was and get 3 different answers. So do you really know which one to try? And the reality is, I found more often than not that locals, they want to know, they want to share their information. It's not malicious. they just don't know the area outside of their own town. You show them a map, they've probably not seen a map. They, you point to where you are and they wouldn't know. So getting some verbal directions, usually by landmarks, is a good way to do it. It can also lead to just some really fun detours. So this is in Honduras. I wanted to kind of see the sights in Honduras, and found on my map this dwarf forest. I went into a local kind of like tourist information center in the middle of town, and the woman had no idea. So she calls over this policeman. The policeman had no idea, but kind of knew roughly maybe where it could be. And so we both set out to try to find it. And yes, while I was going down this dirt back road, I kept on thinking to myself, as a single white female traveler, I probably should not be doing this. But the reality was, they were just as curious as I was, because they had never been, and he couldn't find it. So he stopped on the side of the road and asked, a local farmer, where it might be. And so they finally found it. As you can see in the lower corner, it's not a whole lot to look at, but it was just kind of a fun thing to go find. And I think for him, it made his game a little more interesting, because he didn't have anything else to do at that time. It does lead me to the little man with the big gun can be there to help. And I do not mean this in a derogatory way at all. You have to understand, I am 6 feet tall. I stood a head or more above everybody else's head in most of Central America. But it's the man with the gun who calls the shots. So whatever he says, kind of take his lead. And so this was at a border crossing where the bank was closed. We arrived during lunch. He kept on kind of looking over at us and checking on us, and it did make me nervous. But the moment the windows rolled up, he basically called us over and said, go ahead. So we made our transaction, got out of there super quick. He probably saved us a couple hours of waiting in line behind everybody else. Again, the very helpful guy at a checkpoint, the Ejército, an army checkpoint in Venezuela. They wanted to know where we were headed, and so we showed him on a map, and he basically said, there was known guerrilla on the road, and to not go ahead that route, to go this other route. And so we ended up taking some detours and not seeing what we wanted to, but it's better to kind of play it safe than not. It couldn't have happened though without being able to communicate with him. So I can't stress enough, if you can take classes, there's a lot of online classes that you can take ahead of time, so I ended up spending a couple weeks in Guatemala, just taking a refresher course. I had hoped that my Spanish in high school would come back to me when I became immersed and started traveling, but the reality was 10 years of not using it, it didn't. So these couple weeks kind of set me up for the rest of the trip and being able to speak, even if it was minimally, with the locals. Because the reality is, wherever you go, you're going to draw attention. People want to ask you questions, sometimes about your trip. Most of the time it's about your motorcycle. They love to ask how much it costs. I always come up, even saying $1,000 is a lot to them. But it's good to be able to interact. It's good to be able to ask questions, get knowledge about what to go see, where to go eat, and most importantly, to how to order a beer at the end of the day. Probably the other thing you'll want to know Spanish for is how to ask for motorcycle parts. So it's not if, but when it breaks down. I ended up fixing my motorcycle a lot. This is carburetor problems that I had in Mexico. Luckily got those sorted. I mean, it was like a small, tiny part that I found at Home Depot eventually that helped, help the fuel mixture, and so I could get back on the road. But I mean, I've had engine mount brackets snap on me that I had to get fixed. I had electrical problems also in Mexico. It ended up being a wire that was exposed and kept on hitting the frame. So I, just wrapping it in some tape ended up solving the problem. But until I found that one wire, which was in the headlight, I had to park on hilltops so that way I could jumpstart my bike in the morning to get going for the day. Going down too many bumpy roads, things start falling off. So it's always important to check your bolts and nuts. My chain tensioners fell off, so I had to kind of makeshift one. Fan problems, I had a lot of these, caused my bike to overheat, ended up having to take things apart constantly. Again, more fan problems. The motor seized, and so I had to have that fixed in Bolivia. And of course, learn how to change a tire. So I made it all the way down to Argentina, 14,000 miles without a flat tire, which was pretty incredible. But then in one day, I got 3 flats. I fixed 2 on the side of the road. But by the time I got the 3rd one, luckily I was just outside of town and rolled it in to get that fixed because I was done taking off my tire that many times in a day. You want to know basic maintenance. This was shortly after getting off the Stahlrat, which was the way I got from Panama to Colombia, with a bunch of other riders. Once we reached Colombia, it was kind of a good time to change your oil, check your chain, do a bolt check, just go over the motorcycle, make sure it's in good shape, because at least motorcycle parts there were, or at least consumable parts, were easy enough to find that might as well get it while you can, do some maintenance before you move on. It was also a good time to wash the salt off after being at sea for that long. This is also at the Salar de Uyuni. So after kind of riding around some very beautiful salt water, wanted to wash that off before it corroded any parts. So as you'll notice in most of the pictures, I was smiling because you got to go with the flow, and just usually the flow is a little slower on Latin time. And it's what I call kind of the tranquilo effect, is you get into the groove, the slow rhythm, and just enjoy the good with the bad. Because one thing you'll notice is that no trip is perfect. Some days you'll have amazing food, some days you won't. And so speaking of flow, when they say don't drink the water, they mean it. I was enjoying pretty much everything I had in Peru. It was some of the best cuisine I tried in all of the countries that I visited, but I shouldn't have drank the juice or whatever this watery substance was, because I ended up getting really sick afterwards. The only upside to that is the medicine was available and cheap. Weather-wise, some days will be absolutely gorgeous. In Argentina, we got a ride pretty much until sunset, which was fairly late in the day at that point with how far south we were. But then other days, you're riding into a storm. Just got to put on that extra layer and hope that it's waterproof. Again, Bolivia. So when I had some difficulties in Bolivia, when we arrived, me and a few other riders kind of arrived at the same time. It was their kind of week of Carnival. It's nothing like, Brazil hosts. But so there was a lot of festivities going on, and going past some of these smaller towns, some kids would come running out and wave and yell turista and then, go back. But there were a couple times where the kids would come running out and you'd stop, kind of slow down to stop and you wave. The kids were throwing rocks. And so a couple of them had pretty good aim and hit my helmet, could feel it, kind of the impact pull off. And so I decided I'm not going to slow down for these kids anymore. I do believe that these kids grew up to be 4x4 drivers for tourists, because on my way out on this road going down to Chile, a tour, a 4x4 tour driver was coming back from the area and basically swerved at me, and I ended up swerving to the side of the road, going over the side, going over my handlebar, somersaulting into a ditch. And this was my one and only accident I had on the entire trip. But I will not judge all locals equally, because the next local who drove by stopped and helped me pull my bike out of the ditch, set it up right, kind of cleaned off, and I was on my way. So that leads me to respect the culture that you're in. We don't all work for National Geographic, whether, I'm a photographer, and so I was really looking forward to taking all of these pictures along the route. But after seeing this early on in Mexico, looking at these ladies who just obviously do not want to be bothered, they do not want to be photographed, and this tourist is just not paying attention to it. It kind of gave me a different perspective on where I was and how to interact with locals. There's plenty of people who are willing to stand in front of the camera and take a photograph for you. And so it's a lot more fun for both sides to engage in that kind of experience. You both walk away from it equal, thinking kindly of each other instead of the opposite. Getting a little farther south, it ended up being that people wanted money for photographs. Like the little kid on the left with the llama is obviously just there to be paid to take pictures. The lady on the right, I could at least barter, I buy something, can I take your picture? And so it ended up kind of working out that way. This is how they make their livelihood. So try to be supportive of it. I did find this out the hard way by this woman yelling at me for taking her picture without buying something. And I found out later that these guys paid for the most expensive piece of pineapple in Colombia because I was taking her picture. Sorry, guys. So last few bits I'll leave you with. The next country is the scariest. So starting in the US, when I would share with people that I was going to be taking this trip down south, I would get a lot of concerned comments about, don't you know how dangerous it is, especially in Mexico, and better be careful. And my response to them was, well, I'm not going to go into known unsafe neighborhoods in the US. I mean, I lived in LA as well. There's plenty of those around. Just use some common sense as to where you go, travel mostly during the daylight, not at night, and look out around you. Don't just, walk blindly into any situation. And so heading into Mexico, they would ask, where are you headed? And so I'd say Guatemala. And then they'd be like, oh no, like, don't you know how dangerous Guatemala is? There's, lots going on and you got to be careful. You really shouldn't be traveling by yourself. And so, I, would just say, thank you very much for your concern. And then I'd head south. And when I got to Guatemala, they would ask again, where are you going? I'd say Honduras. And they would again, oh no, that's too dangerous for you to go to. And I finally started asking, well, have you been there? And they said, oh no, we would never go because we watch the news and we see how scary it is. So I kept on getting this all the way through this, the countries, especially through Central America, heading south. And every country was fearful of the country south to them. And then I thought it was really funny when I met some Canadians. So thinking about that for a minute, I mean, they got the same thing about, don't you watch the news? All of what they show on the US? Are you sure you're going to be okay riding around the US? So, my advice that I'll leave with you is don't watch the news, don't listen to the media. Ask other travelers, whether it is those who have gone before you on a forum or those who are traveling the opposite way as you on their way up, because there were plenty coming up as I was going down. And they will give you the most accurate information, what roads to go on, maybe some places to avoid. And it's just a really good exchange of information. So keeping that conversation going is probably the best thing. So technical difficulty. The last thing I'll leave you with is just go. All the planning and preparation won't really prepare you for the experiences that you're going to have. You can research all you want, but just getting that experience and traveling and meeting people along the way is something that is not like anything else I have experienced. I took 187 days, which is about 6 months, to ride 16,000 miles, and it wasn't enough time. I have my route highlighted here in blue with all these dots, and it's such a small portion of all there was to see along this route. I could have easily, spent twice the time covering half the distance, because it was just such an experience with the people that I got to meet along the way, both other riders and locals, being invited into people's homes, just wanting to share stories. It was really, as they say, an experience of a lifetime. So I'm going to leave you with that and encourage you to go take a travel, whether you have, or go take a trip, whether you have 1 month, 6, or a couple years, because it's really something worth experiencing. So I want to thank you all for joining me during this. Hope you can take away some fun tidbits out of that. And hope you've been enjoying a virtual Overland Expo this weekend. I hope to see you at a live Overland Expo in the near future. Thanks, guys.